Okay, so this is chapter 11, stress and disease. So we're going to start with figure 11.2, and we're going to look at a few hormones that are part of this stress response. So first, you can see at the top of the diagram, you have this stressor, which initiates the central nervous system. And then what happens is you get a sympathetic nervous system response, which involves norepinephrine and epinephrine. So looking at the norepinephrine, this actually then initiates the action of what they call neuropeptide Y, NPY, and that will cause vasoconstriction, vascular growth factor presence, and the angiogenic factor. And so when you get into angiogenic factor, there could be swelling involved in this or inflammatory response. Also with norepinephrine, you get an increased blood pressure, you get that pupil dilation, and then the goosebumps, so the piloerection response. You also can get the sweat gland action, so increase sweating of the axillary area in the palms, and then you get an increase in the arterial smooth muscle contraction. So again, leading to this, increased blood pressure, or heightness of or awareness of the situation. Then you have epinephrine, which is causing the bronchodilation, the increased lipolysis, and then some liver effects. So if you look at further down, you get this increased force and rate of cardiac contraction, so like increased heart rate. So you get an increase in cardiac output, so you get better blood flow to areas of the body in which you need more blood flow, so like the brain, the skeletal muscle. And then you get, from the increased lipolysis, you get increased circulating of free fatty acids, which can be used as an energy source. Then you get the stimulation of the pancreas, which actually decreases insulin, but increases glucagon. So that if you decrease the insulin, you get decreased glucose uptake from the skeletal muscle cells and the adipose tissue. And then you get the increased glucagon. So with that, you get the increased gluconeogenesis, which then leads to the increased blood glucose along with the decreased uptake. And that's important because sugar is your first line of energy. So any kind of immediate stress, you're using your first two lines of energy, your glucose and your fats. Then if you get the stimulation of the hypothalamus, you stimulate the presence of the corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, which then will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. And then that then produces a response of the cortisol from the adrenal cortex. And then cortisol has varying effects that I've actually listed here in this power slide. So it increases blood glucose with the help of epinephrine, growth hormone, and glucagon. It decreases that uptake of glucose by cells, so glucose is readily available for energy. It affects protein metabolism because, again, we don't need protein. Protein's more for transportation and structure, so we don't need it in this stress response. And cortisol can have both an anti and pro-inflammatory effects. It does decrease T1 helper cells. It promotes gastric secretion. It increases calcium excretion. You get a decrease in fibroblast proliferation. So that can actually affect healing of connective tissue, and it decreases bone formation. So then, therefore, you don't get any kind of healing as well. And then there's a dendritic shrinkage in the medial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala and hippocampus. So a lot of this is the learning memory centers, as well as centers for controlling impulsive behavior, helping with abstract thinking and organizational processes. So those get affected as well. if you look at, let's see, I believe it's table 11.3, this also goes into further detail of the effects of cortisol. So you can review that as well. Now, going back to the diagram, so the other thing we get with the initiation or the stimulation of the hypothalamus is the stimulation of the posterior pituitary, where we get a release of antidiuretic hormone, which is going to promote water retention from the kidneys. So we have a decreased urinary output. And it also has vasopressin activities, which increases blood pressure. So again, you can look at that diagram, figure 11.2, more at your leisure to get a better understanding of these hormonal effects. Then looking further at the catecholamines, table 11.1 goes over these effects. And I'm not going to necessarily read it to you. You can go through that on your own. But what I want to say about catecholamines is that they can alter the immune system by increasing natural killer cells and cytotoxic T cells. And a lot of these go after mutations and cancer cells. So that's really what they're involved in. But by stimulating catecholamines, you also get a very little increase in your lymphocytes. So like your B cells and your T cells. So that lymphocyte response is reduced. But catecholamines increases pro-inflammatory cytokines. So you're talking about interferons, interleukins, tumor necrosis factor. There's several of them. And then if you look at table 11.2, there's these other physiological effects when you stimulate your alpha and beta receptors. And again, I'm not going to necessarily go through and read this to you, but you can use that as a guide as you're studying the material. Then looking at figure 11.7, this is a diagram of kind of what I've just been talking about. So you can see where you have the stressors coming in, getting the cortisol epinephrine effects, as well as the norepinephrine. You get that inflammatory response. You see the mast cells, the histamine, the monocytes in there, and then the histamine, as we discussed before, causing that acute inflammation type response. But what you can also see with the effects of the catecholamines is you're getting a reduction of the helper T1 cells. So therefore, you don't produce as many cytokines, which it also, you get a increase of interleukin 12. So you get what they call a decreased cellular immunity. But on the right side, what happens is you actually get the promotion of the T helper 2 cells, which then increases cytokines, also interleukin 10, which then you get an increase in humoral immunity, which is the B cells, your antibodies. And then it also promotes eosinophils and mast cells and all the effects of the mast cells that we went over prior. So that's what that diagram is describing to you. Then if you go further into the chapter looking at figure 11.8, again, this can tell you a little bit more about the action of a lot of these proteins. And then there's other hormones that influence the stress response that you can look over in table 11.4. But for my purposes, I really wanted just to go over the catecholamines, the ADH, and the cortisol. Thank you.